Very good Monday, May morning to all of you, and welcome to Empower Community Foundation's 2021, produced and hosted by Community Giving of Minnesota as our first all-virtual conference. We welcome over 170 attendees from 21 states and 77 community foundations. I am Bruce Polig, current chair of Community Giving's board, and our third chairperson as we close our sixth fiscal year, the end of next month. As the umbrella entity for the 9 autonomous foundations comprising community giving, we aspire to empower community foundations everywhere. That's our strategic intent. Thank you for attending this conference and helping to further empowering community foundations. We are all keenly aware of the myriad of events ongoing throughout our country, and at least we are generally aware of key global events transpiring in this new decade of the 2020s. In this conference, we will address the role of community foundations in dealing with local impacts of such events, as well as the internal functioning of community foundations. And now, please permit me, if you would, a moment of personal reflection on an event that occurred on this date, May 17th, 67 years ago. On this day in 1954, the US Supreme Court unanimously ruled in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. That year, I was a 6-year-old boy in Richmond, Virginia. The decision of the court was a seminal moment with long-term aspects upon the social, political, and economic fabric of our country. I have witnessed the impact of that decision for over 7 decades. Now we have new and more frequent seminal moments affecting our communities. How we deal with them or do not deal with them will have pronounced effects upon our communities for decades to follow. As responsible members of community foundations among the various states we represent, I invite you to participate fully in this 2021 annual conference for the betterment of all our communities. Please enjoy our speakers, panelists, and discussions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. John Long, the CEO of Akoya Go. John's company is the presenting sponsor of our conference. I've had the privilege of meeting John virtually through a community giving committee meeting in which John presented, and have a high regard for him personally and his company, Akoya Go. John, the microphone is yours.
Thanks a lot, I appreciate that. And thanks for the history there. I mean, I didn't remember it was on this date. I mean, that is, just like you're saying, that what a pivotal time in our community here. So for me, Akoya Go, it's formerly known as Camp, is our company. We provide software solutions for a lot of different community foundations. Very honored to be a part of this session. Obviously, what community giving is doing in general, and the whole thing. Just look at the headline here of annual conference, Empowering Community Foundations. Just looking through this, I'm sure you guys have as well looked through the agenda here in the next 4 days. Congratulations on being here and taking the time to do so, because we all know time is tough. But what that means to me, and looking at the number of people, we have 62 already, participants right now. This means people are looking at trying to do their community foundations better. So I would encourage you, as you're listening to all this talented speakers here, to look through and think about your own community foundation of how can you do it better. Think of ways that what we did yesterday, day before, and whatnot might be right, but there might be better. And I always like that iterative, trying to get better at it. So for me, I'm excited about watching this next section here with creating pathways and building community, because that networking, the ability to create those pathways, really is going to be a key to our future together. Thanks for letting me be here. Maybe I should talk more.
Oh, it's me, John. This is Steve Jewell.
Thanks.
With Community Giving. Thank you so much. And thank you to Bruce, the board chair of Community Giving, We have an incredible, dedicated group of volunteers, as do all of you who we benefit from their leadership. And a huge thank you to you, John, and the Akoya Go team for your sponsorship of this year's Empower CF 2021. You know, many of us who've been in the field for a while, we often say we didn't really go to school for this. And in fact, if there's anything we know, we have to be grateful to those who've gone before us, as well as our colleagues and peers, because this is a wonderful, incredible field of community foundations, because we learn from one another. And that's really what this conference is really all about, is simply an opportunity and a chance for each of us to learn from one another. And we are constantly learning, constantly growing. And when we started planning for this, initially, the plan was to do a conference and continue to help support our boards of directors and staff. And it just kept growing. And we said, well, if we're doing it, why not open it up? We all learn better when we invite more people to the table. And so having more people participate is just a great opportunity for us to learn from each other. And so to each of you who's tuning in now or will tune in, we have a number of people who've registered who maybe won't be here right at this minute, but they're hoping to get the recordings, or they're going to participate in some segment of the conference. But it's all of you combined that make this conference valuable, because it's the networking, it's the meeting and hearing your ideas and hearing your thoughts, because again, that's how we learn and that's how we grow. I really want to thank all of our sponsors, Akoya Go, who just has stepped up to be our premier sponsor, and thank you so much for your support making all of this possible. The Minnesota Initiative Funds, there's 6 of them across Minnesota, regional foundations and community foundations that serve their regions. We're so delighted to have you and your support. Of course, our trade association here in Minnesota, the Minnesota Council on Foundations, Susie Brown and the team there, we're grateful for all that you do to support our field. The Blandon Foundation, of course, focuses on rural areas of Minnesota, and appreciate greatly their support. And Data Marketing, social media marketing firm here in the greater St. Cloud, Minnesota area. Fantastic support, and really appreciate your involvement with this. Couple of housekeeping items as we're moving towards our keynote speakers today. First of all is that if you're wondering about how do I log in, how do I connect, how can I find the link to the next session that I want to attend, is just go to communitygiving.org/login. And the username's quite simple, EmpoweredCF21, and a really hard password to remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This will take you to a place where you'll be able to pick the session you want to attend, as well as then see the login, and then just log on to Zoom. We appreciate the patience everybody has, because I'll be honest with you, before this pandemic started and COVID, we had never done a webinar. And since then, we've done about 40 plus of them around various topics and conversations where we've tried to keep the conversation going in our respective communities. And I will tell you, every time we do this, we learn. And so doing this here as well, I appreciate your patience, but we always appreciate your thoughts and ideas. So if you have any questions whatsoever, email admin@communitygiving.org. Our phone number is there at 320-253-4380. The team here at Community Giving, I can't say enough positive things about thanking all the staff for all the work they've done, whether it be helping organize a session, leading a session, or just doing a lot of the background work, making this all possible. So huge shout out and thank you to the staff and then all of our other speakers who are going to be here and be part of this conversation. Well, and we also have a way in which these conversations can continue. And, you know, one of the things that we have always, again, enjoyed about the field are the ideas that emerge out of, I would say, it doesn't matter the asset size of the foundation. There are so many wonderful and creative ideas that different foundations are doing that we can learn from each other. And so don't be afraid to share and to speak out and provide ideas of what you are doing, because we can learn from that. And there is a place we call the Idea Center that we created over a year ago. And quite frankly, it hasn't been used as much, but we still believe in its concept that it is a place where you can post ideas. maybe think of a grant that you made that had huge impact in your local community, or a project that you did that really impacted the lives of the people you serve. Share that. You can put up a photo or video or any other information about what it is you are doing in your local community. And somebody I know will probably find that valuable, and they will appreciate not only that, it's in those places that you can start to build relationships and start to build connections to some of your colleagues. And again, I've been fortunate to be in the field for a number of years, and I can't tell you the number of people out there that have helped us as an organization, as a foundation, as me and me personally, because of their ideas and things that they've shared. So the Idea Center is just that, a place to share ideas. So that's available at ideacenter.communitygiving.org. So with that, I would like to once again have a few helpful hints, because as again, we're not all experts in this, and sometimes we need a little assistance. If you want to view your session in the gallery view or just the speaker only view, you can control that by going up into the upper right-hand corner, and you can select whichever view you want to choose. So I highly encourage you to play around with that and switch up your view and experiment with that. So that's another helpful hint. Now, as we're preparing, we'd like to just share with you a little bit about who's here, who's online. And like I said, we have over 180 people registered. I think, I don't remember the last count on the number of communities, but I believe it was from 77 different communities in 21 different states. So I'm not going to read every single name. When we used to do this in person, we would read the name of every foundation, and they get a chance to respond out in the audience that they're here. So in light of that, we're just going to read through the states here quickly. This is the roll call of states who are present and with us. Maybe not right at this moment, but we'll be tuning in and being a part of some of the sessions going forward. We have California, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, of course, because that's our home area. Lots of names of foundations. I'll let you take a look at that, and you can see who else is here and maybe pick out if a foundation or somebody you wanted to connect with. Feel free to reach out in the chat and connect with them. We also have Montana and New York, North Dakota, Nebraska, Ohio, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Texas, Washington, and Wisconsin. And this was as of Friday, so that we did get a number of registrations over the weekend as well as this morning. So we apologize if we might have missed you. So what we wanted to do, just if people wanted to tell us now where they're from, maybe you can put in the chat and just tell us, where are you from? What community are you from? And where are you tuning in from? And we can just see in the chat and follow and see where people are tuning in from. We got a few. Well, got Carver County, Eden Prairie, Brainerd, New London, Minnesota, Winona, fantastic, Dubuque, Fargo, Minneapolis, Walker, Lake Placid, New York, Grand Forks, East Grand Forks, Brainerd, St. Cloud, Painesville, Austin, lots of different areas, Well, we thought, Greene County, Indiana, Wilmer, wonderful, wonderful. That's awesome. Community foundations are all across this country and actually across the world. And then again, one of the wonderful things is there's a saying in our field is when you've seen one community foundation, you've seen one community foundation, because there are unique attributes to every foundation. And so again, one of the richness of our field is that having several of you here from various communities across the country, we all hope to learn from each other. And again, thank you so much for being here. We also thought we would do a quick poll, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about, let's see, what is your role in your community foundation? And I know Abby was going to throw up a poll here, and if you can respond, it'll give us a rough idea of who's here and who's tuning in. What is your role with your local Community Foundation? We have.
They're
Okay,
still coming in. I'll get about 5 more seconds.
give it a little bit of time here. And then we will see where people, so that's interesting. 15% of board members, 15% are development staff. We have program staff, some marketing, and 37% are board members. That's fantastic. I think, you know, when we go to conferences, it's always wonderful when we are able to have board members join us. Sometimes it's challenging for them to get off of work or take the time to do that, but virtually, we're so glad to see 37% of our audience here are board members. And then finance and administrative people, fantastic, 12%. We have a saying also in at community giving and with our foundations, and that is that we really work hard with trying to work with our boards and our volunteers. As staff, we're involved in this on a day-to-day basis. And I will tell you, even as a staff member, it can be complicated and cumbersome trying to know and understand everything. But it's especially difficult for board members, volunteers who are coming in and maybe have experience in other nonprofits and other walks of life, and they come to the table. And we like to say that we think there's a direct correlation between the impact of a local community foundation and the education level of its board. So we really like to emphasize getting board members to be a part of the education and part of learning, as well as contributing. So we're so grateful you have taken time out of your day to be here as a board member of a local community foundation. Really, really thank you for being a part of this. And we look forward to also hearing and engaging with you in our conversations as we go forward. Next, we thought we'd ask, how many staff members does your foundation have? How many staff members? We want to quickly see where we can try the poll again. And
Having a little trouble getting it to pull up here.
okay. Please bear with us. And this is one of those flexible moments. We able to give it a second here. Is it working, Abby, you think?
No. Amy, are you able to access it?
That's okay. If we can't get the poll, why don't we do this? If you could tell us in the chat. Oh, there we go. Oh, that's the first poll. You tell us in the chat, how many staff do you have at your local community foundation? There we go. We'll get a rough idea of the staff, the size of foundations that are joining us. Take a few more minutes. All right. Some of you might have added in the chat there. That's great. Okay, Abby, what are the results of this poll? Great. Some community foundations have 0 staff, and that's very understandable. And then the majority of you are coming from community foundations with 1 to 5 staff, and that's great. 6 to 10, about 17%, 11 to 15, 16 to 19, and just a couple, few that are over 20. And again, I think some of us who've been in the field for a while understand and know what it's like when we're smaller, and just it's very challenging with the smaller foundations because you still got to do everything and trying to make everything work. You wear a lot of hats, and as you grow, you sometimes are able to provide other positions, but I would say community foundations in general, staff and being a staff member can be challenging because you always seem to be maybe just slightly understaffed as an organization, at least over our lifetime. That's been somewhat what we have experienced. And then how long have you been connected to your community foundation, whether you're a board member or a staff or involved maybe even in the field? How long have you been connected? And we're going to ask that and see if we can pull that up as a survey as well. How's it going, Abby? Is that, there we go. Staff size. Oh, that's staff size. Here we go. How long have you been connected to your local community foundation? You can respond and let us know that. Again, this gives us an idea of who's all with us. All right. There we go. We have 18% of us under 1 year, 18% of 1 to 3 years, 28% 4 to 6, about a quarter of the people from 7 to 15, and then 12% over 15 years. That's a great distribution, wonderful distribution. And here again, we hope that you have a chance to reach out and meet people in all of these categories, because the one thing I've learned is just because some of us have been in the field for a long time doesn't mean we have it figured out. It just means we've been in the field for a long time. And so some of the best ideas come from some of the new people who've just entering the field, and they're connected to a local community foundation. And then sometimes there are things that those who've been in the field for a while offer as experience. But again, the key behind this is trying to connect and engage and really learn from each other. That's what this is all about. We do have panelists and other people talking, but please engage and connect in this conference, because it's through your connections, interactions that we all learn. So now we're going to start moving into our keynote speakers here in just a minute. But you know, as I was preparing to be online today, and I started thinking about the why, you know, my own personal why. I've been fortunate to be in the field for a number of years, and I've always told people that I think I have one of the best jobs in the world working at a local community foundation. But really, I know each person I've met in the field, I really believe they all have their own personal why. And I think my own personal why really came to light over the course of the last year. First, the pandemic. We never experienced anything like it. Working remotely, working in our homes, trying to do anything we could to help our local communities and help our donors and stay connected to boards and communities. And then right here in Minnesota, the murder of George Floyd and what that brought to light, and the challenges and the divisions that exist in our country. And we went through an election, and then we, here in Minnesota, once again, with the killing of Daunte Wright, experienced another resurgence of what divisions exist in our society and the challenges that our local communities face. And then over the weekend, I'm listening to the news about what's happening in Israel and Hamas and what's going on in the West Bank. And yes, it's across the oceans, but in today's world, it's right next door. And you look at all the many challenges that our worlds face. And if you think about it, we really have an opportunity to, I think, break through some of these areas by simply coming together. We're going to be talking later about social capital, especially on Thursday with Dr. Putnam joining us. And I know it's not just that simple. I know there's lots and lots of other things that come into play, but at the very base level, at least over the years, I've learned when people can come together, reasonable people, sometimes maybe not reasonable, but people can come together and they can be open to talking and open to listening and learning and trying to connect. We have the potential to build a path forward, an opportunity to build bridges. I remember an individual who lived here in St. Cloud a number of years ago, and we provided a grant to St. Cloud State University in the Holocaust Center. And they led a group of students and leaders in St. Cloud of many different nationalities and ethnic backgrounds to go visit the Holocaust Museum. And when you think about it, the divisions that exist, there is no, the fact that genocide is absolutely the ultimate most terrible tragedy of hate that can exist between two people and two races, and war. And that group that went to the Holocaust Museum came back and spent a lot of time talking about it. And one of the individuals that led that was a gentleman by the name of Walid Issa, who grew up on the West Bank, but then had lived and was connected with many of the Jewish communities here in the United States. And he had really built bridges. And I remember his thoughtful words that he would bring to our conversations and our discussions about being open to listening and learning from one another. And I guess that's what we hope to create in this conference, is this opportunity for all of us to have some wonderful, engaging, sometimes difficult conversations, and being open to learning, growing, and changing, and doing better than maybe what we've done before. We're very, very excited to have with us this wonderful panel of individuals who are experienced in their own ways in a variety of different areas, to share with us their thoughts about building pathways and building community. And I would like to turn it over to one of our board members at Community Giving, Terry Barrero. Terry is an adjunct professor at the Carlson School of Business, the University of Minnesota. She's a co-author of Social Entrepreneurship, the journey from issue to viable venture. She's a consultant with small foundations and nonprofit organizations, very involved in the Twin Cities community, but also nationally and internationally. She just completed 9 years serving on the board of the Cargill Foundation. And throughout her career, she has sat on nonprofit boards along with state and local government strategic committees, including St. John's University, Way to Grow, an organization which she helped found, and Parent Aware for School Readiness. She's an outstanding leader in her own right, and we're very fortunate to have her as a board member at Community Giving. Terry, welcome, and we'll have you introduce our speakers today.
Thank you, Steve. What a great day. I'm really excited to be able to introduce this panel and to hear what they have to share with us. We've got three different perspectives here. One sort of personal community, one regional community, and one national and global. And so it's a great opportunity for us to hear people talk about how their community, how their perspective on building community plays out in the organizations they work in. The first person I'm going to introduce is Liwanag Ojala. She is the CEO of CaringBridge. It's the first and most widely used global nonprofit social network. It's dedicated to helping families and friends communicate with and support loved ones during a health journey. I have been able to use CaringBridge a number of times with family and friends who are going through life-changing transitions, and it's a wonderful tool. Liwanag jumped into the COO role at CaringBridge in 2014 and moved into the CEO role in 2015 following the founder, and helped bring that organization into its now global role. The CaringBridge was founded in 1997, and since then 800,000 people have used CaringBridge as a way to communicate in these kinds of very personal and challenging health-related family situations. Before she joined CaringBridge, she was in the for-profit side looking at creating digital strategies for grocery providers, including president of Simon Delivers and general manager at Coban's Delivers. She has great accolades. You can read her bio for all the many accolades she has received so far, one including the top 500 executives selected by the Minnesota Monthly. She also has a law degree, and I discovered that she was the commencement speaker at the University of Minnesota yesterday or Saturday at their commencement. So she's got a wide perspective. Our second speaker, I'm not sure if this is the order they're going to go in, so we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Our second speaker is Tonya Allen. Tonya is the new president of the McKnight Foundation, joining us earlier this year. McKnight is a Minnesota-based family foundation that has the goal to advance more just, creative, and abundant future where people and planet thrive. They give away about $100 million a year and focus on climate solutions in the Midwest, creating an equitable and inclusive Minnesota. They also do grants and fellowships in the arts, neuroscience, and international crop research. They have a wide variety of interests. McKnight Foundation was founded in 1953 by one of the early leaders of 3M Corporation, and William and Maud McKnight started it. And it's been a powerful resource in Minnesota to help create community and strengthen the kinds of resources we have. Before Tonya jumped to the McKnight Foundation, she was based in Detroit and served as president and CEO of the Skillman Foundation. The Skillman Foundation has done a lot of work in Detroit, helping to build children and family strategies so that Detroit was a city that was a great place to raise children. She is chair of the Council of the National Council on Foundations, chair of the Oakland University Board of Trustees. She was named Michigan of the Year newsmaker. And again, you can read her resume online to find out more about her. Finally, Neel Kashkari. Neel's perspective is national and international. He is the president and chief executive officer of Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and is also serves on the Federal Open Market Committee, making sure that the 9th District really is represented in that kind of discussion. Under his leadership, the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis has created something called Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, and it works to provide world-class research that helps us understand and improve economic well-being of all Americans. Kashkari wasn't in banking for much of his career. He began his career as an aerospace engineer in Redondo Beach, California, and then moved to a senior position in the Department of the Treasury, where in 2008, he oversaw the Troubled Asset Relief Program and the distribution of that, which I'm sure he could speak to for a significant amount of time and what that had to do with building community. He has been active in the local community and has been partnered with the Supreme Court Justice Alan Page to create a new conversation in the state of Minnesota about how to create quality public education as a fundamental right, including proposing an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution. So those are our three speakers. I don't want to talk anymore because I'm excited to hear them. So why don't we go in the order that I introduced them, and they each are going to give us their perspective on what it takes to build community. And then we'll come back together and have a discussion among the three speakers, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So Liwanag, you want to start?
Sounds great. Terry, thanks so much for the introduction. And I want to say welcome to Tonya. I haven't had a chance to meet her in person, and welcome to Minnesota. And then of course, very happy to be on a panel with Neel as well. So I also want to say a thank you to everybody on the line, because I found that so interesting how long you've worked at the foundations you've worked at, and you just propel so much goodness in the world. And so as you're thinking about this couple of days together and lots of Zooming, I hope you feel really good about the work that you're doing to serve so many families and so many causes that I know that are very dear to you. And then I just want to also add CaringBridge, thank you for that description. We have been around since 1997, and we have had 800,000 people share their story. But in 2020, we had 43.5 million people visit a CaringBridge site. So our reach is quite vast. I was looking at all the states that were represented in the community foundations today, and I am certain that we have had many users of CaringBridge in the states that you represent. So there's just 4 key points that I want to share with you today as I think about the conference theme, creating pathways and building community. And the first one, of course, has to do with digital, because that's the world I've come from, both in the for-profit sector, as Terry mentioned, as well as CaringBridge the last 7 years. And there is so much negative coverage about the negative impacts of what social network use has done. But CaringBridge is a positive force on the internet, and we're so proud of that, because it's really a safe place for patients and caregivers to tell their story at a very vulnerable time. So the first point I want to make is the organic creation of a digital community is really, really, really powerful. And of course, digital technology is ubiquitous. So we are all using it, especially in this past year when we couldn't be physically connected to some of the communities that we really needed to have to support both mental and physical well-being. I want to point out too that it's not just young people. The fastest growing segment and users of social networks in the country are over the age of 55. So I mention that because I think sometimes people think about, well, that's for young people. Well, candidly, if you look at the 40 to 50 million caregivers that we're going to be having in this country in the next 5 to 10 years, a lot of those people, by the way, 10% of those are under the age of 18, caregivers, right? So it isn't just young people using these digital communities to stay connected, it's all ages. And the research really demonstrates that the use of that the benefit of telling your story has both physical and mental benefits. So Dr. Annie Brewster at Mass General and our own research with Dr. Mary Jo Kreitzer at the University of Minnesota through our research collaborative really demonstrates how important it is for people to share their story and for a community to be part of it. And as I mentioned, this past year has been so important to continue to stay connected with people who really need help from the community. The second point I want to make is the importance of deeply understanding the people that you're serving. And I'm saying that from a nonprofit standpoint. We see the people we serve in digital every single moment. They are a great resource that tells us how we can better serve them. And because we are an online program, we have a lot of data to understand how both they're using the service and what they're saying they need from their community. One example of the importance of community to share is we've realized from our users that asking for help is really, really hard. And so what we tried to do is to solve what we've called the lasagna problem. And especially the fellow people from Jersey, which is where I'm from, somebody's feeling sick, you make a lasagna. That's what we did. I guess it's a hot dish here in Minnesota. But what we did when we learned that insight is to better improve our planner and try to figure out, okay, what are the new planning tools that we can allow the community to activate? Because that's a lot of people coming. And then there's a lot of people who don't know what to do. It's also hard to know how to help. So we created a location on the site called Advice and Inspiration. And it's not medical advice, but it gives people little tips on how to help a caregiver, how to talk to kids about cancer, how to write a condolence note, things that people really need to know how to do in that moment, but they don't know how. So my third point is about partnerships, and this won't be a surprise to people who work in community foundations, but the right partnership can really propel a lot of magic. We did a lot of research and understanding what it is they need and what are their other core needs beyond sharing their story. And that led to some really interesting partnerships with people who do things that provide services to patients and caregivers that we do not do in technology. As an example, we have a really strong partnership with GoFundMe. We have a partnership with MealTrain. Just recently launched partnerships with Shipt and Zoom. So instead of trying to do these things ourselves, we decided, well, there's already a best-in-class partner out there who does some of these technologies. So how do we integrate it into the user so that we can help them make sense of the chaos in health? And then, of course, another example of partnerships is the many outreach partnerships we have around the country. They are closer to the delivery of care. And so oftentimes the caregiver, which represents about 65% of the people writing on CaringBridge, feel like an invisible person in the room as the patient is getting a diagnosis or the healthcare professional is sharing the protocols that have to happen at home. And so how do we get closer to those folks and tell them about CaringBridge? So we have hundreds of hospital network partners across the country, as well as specific national health condition associations like the American Heart Association, Alzheimer's, as well as cancer organizations. And then my final point is just a little nudge to community foundations. We need the benefit of your strategic nudges to allow us to think differently about the work that we do from as a nonprofit. So, as if any of you are on the line are board members, you're always in the boardroom asking about strategic questions that prompt different discussion with management. So what I'm saying is very similar to that. Nudge us to be creative, nudge us to think differently about the way we are developing our programs. And I'm not saying don't be too easy on us. We still need measurement to demonstrate our impact, and we still need your patience, and we still need all of those things, your support and partnership and all those things. But sometimes foundations have very specific questions that don't allow nonprofits to go outside of their box and think really differently about how to solve problems. We've had the benefit of some great foundations who have supported us that pose questions like, how would you tackle this problem versus this is how we want to solve the problem? And I think that's a really important conversation as nonprofits try to use best-in-class techniques, as well as really think differently about how to solve problems for the future. So those are kind of the 4 points I'd like to make. Looking forward to hearing Tonya and Neel's thoughts as well for a really good discussion.
Thank you, Luana. Tonya? McKnight Foundation and Skillman Foundation perspective. I'm sure you have both to share.
Well, thank you so much, Terry. And I want to just thank you for the warm welcome that I've received here. So, the theme of creating pathways and building community, and how do we go about doing that? And so I have one answer. It's called radical love. And so let me just say, I think that community philanthropy, if we're going to be really successful in addressing the inequities, we're going to have to go back to our etymological origins, where philanthropy means the love of people and refers to the desire to promote the welfare of others. Now, community philanthropy, in my opinion, must reimagine itself as a purveyor of community love by addressing issues that are in the best interest of people. Community philanthropy must address the root issues. And in Latin, radix means root. And it is also the base word for radical. So the definition of radical is get to the heart of the root of something, or to favor drastic political, economic, or social reforms. Thus, to me, community philanthropy really, its hallmark ought to be radical love. Radical love, in my opinion, demands that community philanthropy make society better by addressing those root causes of suffering, which squarely point, in my opinion, to social and racial equity. And this is about addressing those historical, political, and social systems that are compounded by isms that perpetuate inequality and inequity. So in order for us to do this, so you might say, well, how do you go about doing that? I have 5 thoughts about it, even though there's so many more ways that we can do it. The first is that we have to do the work from the inside out. So this has to be personal as well as institutional. The second is that we have to take advantage of our competitive advantage, which is to be rooted in context, but to also apply strategically content. The third is we have to build trust and respect distrust. The fourth is that we have to wrestle with this concept of power. How do we build it? How do we share it? And how do we wield it? And then lastly, our leadership has to really be about how do we advance and focus it on creating change. So how do we enable it? How do we make it faster and quicker rather than how do we just manage change? So it's a different shift, I think, in the way that we think about our work. So starting with this notion from the inside out, the personal and the institutional. As you all know, as we've been wrestling with this notion of a racial reckoning across the country, that we all have to do our work. And what I mean by that is literally is like, we have to find the time for us to investigate what we believe, how we behave, and why we believe it and why we behave that way. And what part of history or the historical record are we leaving out in our analysis? And I think if we, I think we just all have to be on a journey. And that's what I think is the most important thing for us to do in community philanthropy, is help set up ourselves by facilitating learning and discussions with organizational leaders, trustees, and staff, integrated within your current work. It shouldn't be a special add-on. It should be about how you do your work in general. And then once you're doing that work, how do you really create the space inside of your communities to be able to do that work? So we have to make sure that this lives in the fabric of our community, where we're fostering belonging and bridging and not othering people, which I think is a common thing that we do, even for those who believe that they're promoting equity. It is quite easy for us to other people. So how do we essentially create that space for us all to do our personal and institutional work, and then figure out how to encapsulate that within our organizations, our philosophy, our policies, and our practices, as well as in our communities, where we can hold this tension of like having a really hard conversation, but understanding because we hold a tension does not require us to be against each other. The second, I guess I would share with you, is this notion of being rooted. So understanding the power of the combination of content and context. So as community philanthropy and community foundations, there's a strategic advantage here, which is our context. We know places like nobody else knows them. And if we know them really well, then we should be really thinking about like, how does change happen in our communities? And we should be thinking about, how do we begin to build and apply content knowledge? Now, generally speaking, our foundations are limited in some ways, meaning that we don't, like national foundations get to go around, or even global foundations, they go all around the world to find the places that they want to work, where they feel like the conditions are ready. Whereas with community philanthropy, you actually cannot do that. You have to work within the means, within the community you're in. And so there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a limitation. It just means that we have to think more creatively about how we use our wisdom to implement strategy. And to, again, hold this tension that is sometimes that exists, content, despite the substance and fidelity of subject matter, just does not always translate easily in local context. Likewise, those of us who focus more on context are often mired in the challenges of geography and politics. And then we're less likely to really have our work grounded in sound research and implemented with fidelity. So I would just say alone, either content or context is insufficient. Together, content and context are complementary. And if both of them are done and they're integrated alongside each other, I think what we can have is an amplified impact that really allows change to occur. The third thing is this notion of trust and distrust. So community philanthropy is an enabler of community change, if you believe that, and social equity via radical love. But it also has to be a curator of trust. It has this responsibility of building trust and being a respecter of distrust. I love this quote where it says, it takes immaturity to be hurt by the fact that someone does not trust you. We have to remember communities have experiences, and that distrust is grounded in something. So this is really an equitable practice. How do you value what people's experiences are and listen to them and not make it about yourself? And at the same notion, how do you begin to build trust? And I love this formula, the trust equation. Trust is equals credibility plus reliability and intimacy over the perception of your self-interest. So how do we begin to use this trust equation and really think through how we help communities bridge conflict and build trust? Sharing and wielding power, which I noted. I love Martin Luther King's quote, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against it." And then one other quote is, "Justice is what love looks like in public." Right? So we have to, if that's the case, then we have to wrestle with this question of how do you rewrite the rules? And rewriting the rules is about power. And so we have to figure out, how do we help our communities build power to rewrite the rules? How do we as institutions use the power and the stature we have to be able to share it with other people? And then how do we wield power? How do we bring our power and other people's power together to make transformational change that we could never do alone? And I think it speaks to this notion of how do we do this in partnership? And then the last thing I would just share before closing is this. Change is foundational to community philanthropy and our collective ambition to make our places healthier domains for everyone who live there. And so we cannot just rely on change happening to us and us managing it and mitigating it. Rather, we have to build a set of competencies that really allow us to step in front of change and create it. How do we begin to be change leaders? How do we help other people see what the possibility of our future is, and that we really help usher them into doing that? And that requires us sometimes looking at the brutal facts, both externally and internally, and creating a climate where multiple voices and perspectives are heard, that again, confronting these tough conversations that are better that better allow us to enable change. And so we just have to be comfortable with that. And I think sometimes philanthropy wrestles with the question of, should we be critiqued because we're doing good? And I always say, it doesn't matter what your intent is, it has to be aligned with what your impact is. And so I would just share with you, like, these are the steps, these are the things that I believe that really allow us to create the pathways that create an environment where radical love actually can exist in our communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Tonya. Wow, wonderful topics that we could continue to talk about for a long time. Thank you. I just want to remind people before we jump to Neel Kashkari that if you do have a question you'd like the panelists to respond to, just drop them in chat. And so now, Neel Kashkari, take it away.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate being invited to join all of you with these distinguished fellow panelists. Great to listen to your comments. You know, I'm going to just start. I've been president of Minneapolis Fed for 5.5 years. I moved to Minnesota to take this job 5.5 years ago. And I'd done my homework on Minnesota before I got here. I knew on average, Minnesota has a highly educated workforce. I knew on average, Minnesota has very good schools. I knew that Minnesota has a very diverse economy. So if you look at in Minnesota's economy, every major sector of the US economy is here. We have agriculture, we have manufacturing, we have financial services, we have mining, everything is here. And so Minnesota has all of these strengths. So I naively thought when I came here, well, everybody in Minnesota must be doing relatively better. Of course, you all know if you peer underneath those averages mask some of the worst economic disparities in the country. They are education disparities, which I'm going to talk more about. They're health disparities, they're housing disparities, they're in every dimension, criminal justice disparities. All of these disparities are massive in Minnesota. I also was pleasantly surprised, though, when I came to Minnesota to find that Minnesota has the richest community of philanthropy and nonprofits and foundations that I've seen anywhere. I mean, I grew up in Ohio, I lived on the East Coast, I lived on the West Coast. It's extraordinary that Minnesota has such a diverse economy, on average, such a high performing economy, such a rich philanthropy and nonprofit sector, and yet such terrible disparities at the same time. What is going on? And so at the Minneapolis Fed a few years ago, we launched this research institute called the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute to dig in and understand why these disparities exist and what can we learn from around the country and around the world to try to bring forward policy solutions to really improve them. I'll observe something as a new Minnesotan, that Minnesota is great at talking about equity. It is great at signaling that we care. The question is, are we actually serious? And I'll give you a little tangible example. One of my coworkers mentioned to me, you know, if you go around the Twin Cities, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of homes with Black Lives Matter signs in their front yard. One of my coworkers told me this, his whole neighborhood, Black Lives Matter signs. They have a good elementary school in the neighborhood, and there was a proposal to expand the elementary school to serve a greater number of students from around the region. Those same families with Black Lives Matter signs in their yard stood up and objected at the top of their lungs, absolutely not are we going to expand that elementary school. Why? Because it might change the culture. They use all sorts of words like this. That's what I call pretending to care. And so what I would say to all of the folks on this Zoom today, as you look at your work, is your work actually empowering those who do not have power today? Or is it just providing more lipstick so we can say, hey, we're doing our part? At the end of the day, this is about power. So 2 years ago, I reached out to Alan Page, former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice, and I asked him, is there a way we could use the law to break through political barriers and literally put children first to lead to systematic transformational change of our education system? Because our education system in Minnesota today is leaving children of color and low-income white children badly behind. And some other states have made real progress, and yet we haven't. And we looked at the Minnesota Constitution. It was written in 1857, the education provision, and it basically says some kids get a great education, other kids get a lousy education, the system overall is adequate, we've met our responsibility. And we said, no, we can do better. Every child needs to have a quality education. And if you do the analysis, young people who get a better education have more and better job opportunities. They earn more money. They get better access to housing. They get better access to healthcare. They get better transportation options. Education is actually at the root of all of these things. But what we're finding as we go down this journey, you know, we've got a bipartisan coalition supporting us. We also have a bipartisan coalition opposing us. Because at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to give power to families that do not have power today to be able to demand better education for their children so that their kids get the same education opportunities that my kids have. And I'm excited about it because it's bipartisan, but it's fascinating to watch people reveal themselves as defending the status quo. The same people who are opposing us in the prior breath will say, we care deeply about education equity. We care deeply, we care so deeply that we're going to fight you for giving power to families that don't have power today. So I would just say, you know, challenge everybody on this call to look at yourself, look at the work that you're doing. Are you actually leading, driving towards systematic change to empower those who do not have power today? Minnesota has been having some version of the same conversation for decades. And despite all of this good work, the system is still stacked. And all of the nonprofits and all of the foundations doing all of their work, you're fighting against the system instead of the system supporting you to drive the kind of changes. And so, you know, one other little example that I find so fascinating, Minnesota, just back to education, Minnesota has something called open enrollment, where in theory, you can send your kid to any public school you want, right? Except that public school has to agree. And then you got to find your way of getting your kid there. So it's open enrollment in name mostly only. It's lipstick. It's not actually real. And so I've only been here 5.5 years, but I'm impatient and I don't want to talk anymore. I don't want to talk about equity anymore. I want to ask, what are we actually doing to give power to those who do not have power today? If we're not giving power to those who do not have power today, then we're just talking. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Neil. That the challenges that you have given us, the challenge that Tonya has given us, and in many ways, Liwanag as well, the trying to understand how to build community and how to make community equitable, accessible, and to empower people who don't feel they're connected to the communities. You've all raised that as something that we need to be paying close attention to. It has your perspective on that changed in the last year as we've all been working from home and trying to zooming too much and what's your observation about how people have begun to rethink community because of the kinds of the pandemic? What do you think?
Well, I would say, I mean, if I may start, that I think the disparities that I talked about, that my other panelists talked about, they've just been exacerbated. And so they were already there, and now they're even more visible, and now they're even worse, whether it's access to broadband, which affects so many families across Minnesota, and we've seen how crucial it is for our economy, for our education, for families. That's one example. Access to healthcare is another example. Then obviously, with the murder of George Floyd, on one hand, I want to be optimistic because now the country is reckoning with these issues, but I'm old enough to remember when Rodney King was savagely beaten and the country was outraged at what happened to Rodney King, and everybody swore never again. So are we serious? Go ahead.
That's the exact thing that I'm worried about as well. I agree with your point about everything being exacerbated. And then, of course, the response by both in the nonprofit and for-profit community, my question is, how real is it? Because every CEO and executive director had to come out with a statement. And candidly, I took a position, I'm going to resist doing that because people here at CaringBridge know that all are welcome. We don't care what your situation is. We're free. We're available to all. So we didn't feel the need to lean into making a statement for the purpose of making a statement. I mean, if we're going to now shift our resources to go do something that's meaningful over us as part of a strategy, that's one thing. But I do worry about all the statements and the, newfound media reckoning. What is it real or not? And, my hope it is. But I also remember Rodney King and watching it on television, and so live, and didn't have YouTube and Facebook and all those things back then. But, those images have stayed with me. And if I can remember that, then what does a child who's seeing some of these things happening in our community, how are they affected mentally by what's happening in their home? So I'd love to hear Tonya's thoughts on this as well.
Oh, thank you so much. I think what I'm hoping we can do as a state is to be declarative about what we want to achieve. Like, let's state it and let's swing for the fences, right? Like, let's figure out how we set aside our egos and actually do something collaborative and collective. And I'm not suggesting like Minnesotans by themselves have egos. I'm just talking about general politics of community, right? And what I've seen as I've been here is that we have lots of disparate pieces. And what I worry about is because we have so many disparate pieces that we actually will be focusing on building these individual pieces that we actually lose the moment for collective impact. So how do we show up together to actually wrestle with these things? And so to Neil's point, everybody's, and to your point, everybody's making statements. Well, fine. Now, what is our accountability metrics that we would use as a community to say, where are you on these statements? Where are you on leading the change that we need? And one of the things that I worry about when I look at like who are supposed leaders of this, it feels like it's being delegated inside of institutions and organizations to the people of color. When in actuality, like this is an issue that we all have to wrestle with. And if your white CEO isn't leading it, I don't think, you know, I understand he or she may be trying to be respectful, but I actually think I would call BS a little bit on that, because you can't delegate change. Nobody delegates significant and meaningful change in their organization. If you believe it's extraordinarily important, if you're a CEO, if you're a leader, you roll up your sleeves and you jump in, and you might have other people who help you. You might have other people that inform you, but never will you take your hands off the steering wheel. And that's the piece that I feel like I've missed seeing here, but not just in Minnesota. I think that this is happening all across the country. And I think it's time for us, if we really want to take this moment and wrestle with it, it's time for us to actually say and hold people accountable, including me at the McKnight Foundation. All of us have to be held accountable, and none of us can be given grace because of the color of our skin. Either way it goes, like, we should be given grace by the actions that we present.
I love what you just said, because it's very similar to sort of women cannot solve gender inequality. It's like, we need men to be part of the solution, because it's not going to happen because women think it's a good idea, right? Just as an example. But just to add on to what you were saying, Tonya, I've seen a lot of leadership, not just here in Minnesota, but all around the country, sort of say, oh, diversity and inclusion and the EIDA programs, now it's your time. It's like, no, it's been our time the whole time. It's just, we needed you to make it our time before 2020. So it's just, no, it's not our time. I heard that, I laughed, because it's like, no, it's been our time the whole time. But now it's time to actually see that that is not a program within your organization. It actually needs to be espoused by leadership and lived, you know, throughout these large organizations. So there's some similarities and some other fights that are still ongoing for equality that I think we can learn from too.
Tonya, one of the concepts you introduced was respecting distrust. And I'm intrigued with that concept. I've not heard it phrased so well before, but can you talk more about how that plays out? Respecting distrust?
Yeah, well, I think what happens is that I'll give you an example, particularly with the pandemic, with the COVID vaccine. Now, set aside like the real intentional manipulation that we see in social media to spread mistruths about that. But part of it is like, if we talk about this and we talk about communities of color who have been hit hardest by COVID, and we talk about them as if they don't really get why it's important to have this vaccine. It's almost like we say, like, oh, you know, all we need to do is go out there and do some more education. Like, maybe we can convince these foolish people that they should not, that they should go and get the COVID vaccine. Like, there's an assumption there that we know what's right and that our logic trumps everybody else's logic, when in actuality, many of these communities who've been hit hardest by COVID have a very specific narrative, and that narrative is grounded in truth. So be it the Tuskegee experiment, where people were with doctors and they did not get the treatment they needed, even though they had a disease. Be it some of the kind of diseases that were spread on native lands and under the cloak that this was about helping versus harming. And so my point is this, it's like, there is a rationale, regardless if you think it is valid or not, there is a real rationale for them to distrust. And by actually understanding why people distrust you and valuing their lived experience, and then approaching the problem with them together, that's a sign of maturity. It's a sign of inclusion. It is a sign of saying, like, I understand that these historical records have happened. And I think that these are big issues, but I think there are also small issues. Like, somebody doesn't want a development deal in their backyard. Why not? What's the rationale behind it? Because if you said that you're going to do low income housing and you had never done low income housing and people actually got gentrified, then of course they should be distrustful of you and be pushing back. So we have to create space for people to tell their stories and also for us to co-create a story that we want to tell together.
Neel?
I thought Tonya covered it very well.
So for Neel, I have a different question for you. Just the changing policy has got to be part of the change we're taking on. And you have taken this big step of, let's change the state constitution. How has that change, how's that going? What kinds of observations have you had about community as you've been trying to institute a whole completely different kind of guidance for how the state should operate?
Well, what's exciting to me, and I think to Justice Page, is that the people who have come out to support are folks that don't normally work together. I mean, we have many Democrats of color who are strong supporters, authors of this legislation, and we've got conservative Republicans from greater Minnesota. And they're folks that don't normally work together. We've got Attorney General Ellison and the CEOs of the biggest businesses in Minnesota. Those are folks that don't normally work together. And so it's really exciting that both, people on both sides are saying enough is enough. We need transformational change because education is too important. And by the way, why does the Federal Reserve care about any of this? For us, it's all about the economy. Our economy is not going to grow. It's not going to be vibrant if we're leaving behind thousands of young people who don't get a good education, who then can't get a good job and can't contribute to our vibrancy and our economic growth. And so that's why we're at this table. And so it's exciting that people are saying there are certain things that go beyond politics. And that is our futures, the futures of all of the children of Minnesota. Those go beyond normal political divisions. And that's what's really exciting. That's what gives me hope. But we do have our work cut out because the way you amend a constitution in Minnesota, different states are different. We have to go through the legislature. We need a majority of the state house and the state senate to pass it. And then it'll go to the voters on a general election ballot. We've seen polling. This is what's remarkable. We've seen polling that says that 80% of Minnesotans would support giving all children in Minnesota a civil right to a quality public education. And that's really exciting. Minnesotans in their heart really care about education. But this is an example. So if the voters are there and look at the results, but the political system needs to catch up to the voters. Yeah. And so right now the challenge is the politics of navigating the political system to give the people a chance to express their opinion. And we're confident if the people are given the chance, they will say, yes, all children deserve this.
We are running out of the sort of private time, and I'd like to invite Sarah Carlson in to help include questions from the audience as well. One of the first ones, as Sarah's joining us, is somebody asked, Tonya, could you repeat your trust definition so we get the full formula that you used?
Yeah, I'm happy to. But let me just say this point that Neel is making. Neel, I think you're right on. And I actually think this is what most states need to be doing, is that we need to go back and change the state constitutions, which actually prevent us from doing this. So I was right on the brink of trying to do that in Michigan, and I'd love to work with you on it here. But the formula is this: trust equals credibility. Like, do people believe that you know what you're talking about? And reliability. Do you show up often enough? And intimacy. Are you in relationship with me? And then you divide that by their perception of your self-interest. So if you feel like if you seem like you're all about getting what you need, then people's trust decreases. But if you're focused on getting what we both need, then their trust increases. If you can also show that you're credible, reliable, and intimate.
Thank you all so much for this very engaging conversation. The first question that has come in from the group is directed to Neel, but I would make space for Tonya and Liwanag to respond as well. And that is, when the issue of education equity is brought up, We often hear schools are not there to resolve family issues. How would you respond to that, Neel?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I also hear people say, it's not about education, it's about poverty. You need to first solve poverty and you got to fix families. Then we can talk about education. Those are great excuses to defend the status quo, because other states are doing a much better job with their low-income families, having much better education outcomes. And, you know, they have families with challenges too. It's not like their families are all, you know, leave it to Beaver perfect. No, their families have challenges too. Those states have poverty too. I find it fascinating that Minnesota is so good at accepting mediocrity. Like, Minnesotans love to tell themselves, we are the best, we're Minnesota. Except in this one dimension, we're gonna accept mediocrity, and we're gonna say this mediocrity makes sense when other states are doing better than we are. So the research is clear, it's just not true. And by the way, last thing, sorry, long answer. The best tool we have, the most powerful tool we have to actually break the cycle of poverty is actually education. So we've got the causation reversed.
Thank you. Tonya or Liwanag, anything you'd want to add?
Okay, I was trying to give Liwanag a moment because she's so brilliant. I didn't want to step in. I would just say this. I think Neel was right on point on this. All families have challenges. And the challenge I would say to us is, why are we still wedded to an educational system that actually doesn't take into account the whole child and the whole context of a child? So if we know that our children need more than what they've gotten in schools, then why are we continuously defending a system that actually doesn't give them what they need? So we should be, just like we're talking about, and I'm not a anti-police person, let me just be really clear about that. But if we're talking about what does reimagining policing looks like, where you actually meet people at their worst moment with the proper supports that they need, why can't we say that for children when they are at their most significantly influential moment in their lives? Why aren't we giving them the extra resources that they need? And I know that Liwanag's motto is essentially that in the health story, and she's using innovation to drive that. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be able to do. And I think, to Neel's point, bringing these diverse opinions, not just to move the policy, but bringing these diverse inclinations as a way to drive what change ought to look like, because our children deserve it, not just the ones that look like us, but even those who don't.
My only add to that, Tonya, would be, then if we're going to change the system, let's actually pay teachers to do that work in a way that makes sense, because that if that is now part of the job, as part of the system that will help support these young people at a very critical time in their lives, then we ought to create systems that also reward the people who do that fantastic work.
Agreed, but can I push on that 1 second? So one of the models that I've been a huge fan of in education has been a model that has said the teacher doesn't do everything. Like, it's actually, the teacher is more like the doctor, and that we add extra people who are more like nurses that come in and surround and support children. And so I'm not in any way opposed to paying teachers what they need, but I would just say, like, there are more possibilities of how we get more caring bodies in schools to support kids if we make the commitment that Neel is arguing, which is every child deserves a high quality education. Then our possibilities open up tremendously.
I love that, Tonya. Great ad.
Wow, okay, now you have hit a nerve. There are all sorts of questions coming into the chat. Several of you talked a little bit about Minnesota Nice and the idea that we skirt the hard issues, right? And so there's a number of community foundations that are representing very rural areas listening today who may not have as much cultural diversity present in their communities. So what thoughts do you have about how to encourage those community foundation leaders to take those bold stances and create the community story together when the cultural diversity that we're talking about in the diversity, equity, and inclusion argument so much right now, especially, is focused on ethnic diversity, and that's not what's present in their community. So what thoughts do you have about that? Let's start with Liwanag.
Ooh, that's a tough one. Well, first of all, I think it's even more important to do that kind of education in communities where there isn't the diversity that's present in their daily lives, because you're expanding their thinking beyond where they may live somewhere else and not be armed with that information in their upbringing. And it frankly puts them at a disadvantage to understanding other things that they may navigate in their world. So it's a tough question, because I know that resources are always limited and choices always have to be made. But to me, it's even more important to do it in communities where there isn't diversity, because they don't have this also lived experience with other students who aren't like them.
If I could add, going back to education for a moment, the education disparities are almost as bad or just as bad in greater Minnesota in white-only communities. Low-income white kids are being badly served by the same systems that are failing children of color and indigenous kids. And so, the population may look a little different, but in many cases, it's the same issues of a system that does not want to change to meet the needs of the children that they are supposed to be serving. So those of you on this call today who are in greater Minnesota serving white populations, take on these systems too. Demand change too, help drive that change too, help empower those families too that are being left behind. And again, these issues are racial issues, but they are not only racial issues. There's a lot of need all around the state, and there's a lot of need for leadership all around the state. And you can help drive change in your community, and you can help drive then change in the state as a whole. And so I'm thrilled that you're here. That's all I would say.
Yeah, and I would argue this is that our ambition ought to be social equity. So for me, what that essentially means is the people who need the most get it. They don't get the least. And that's the construct we currently have, not just in this state, but in multiple states and across the globe, right? And so what I would just say is we cannot ignore that in order to get to social equity, that you cannot ignore racial inequities, right? Because they're so tied. But it also, if you can't ignore economic inequities, as Neel is talking about, or geographic inequities. We cannot get into this thing of fighting each other about who has it the worst, when in actuality, we got to really laser-like attention should be focused on how we get to solutions. And then I would just lift up Dr. John Powell's work where he talked about the curb cut effect, which is, he calls it the targeted universalism. But what he essentially means is curb cut. If you figure out a solution that works for the people who have the most significant challenges, then what happens is that everybody benefits from it. And so the curb cut is, the curb cuts on the sidewalks before, where you couldn't, when you go to the curb, you have to drop down, and particularly people who were using wheelchairs for mobility couldn't get back and forth. When we cut out those curb cuts, what we found was it wasn't just that their lives benefited, but moms with strollers, they benefited, joggers, delivery men who were doing different things, people who bike, they started to have benefits from having these curb cuts. So you start to see that these things can lift the tide or lift the boats for everyone, not just the tide, lift the tide and the boat, right? Or even out the tide and give everybody a boat, whatever might be the right metaphor in that situation. I think that's what we need to be aiming for when we think about what does social equity look like, so you can solve problems that are going on in rural that may benefit children in urban communities too. It isn't just one way or another, and it isn't just about race.
Fascinating. And I completely agree. And my notes are all over the place here right now. So thank you so much for all three of you being so candid, direct, and issuing a really excellent challenge to the leaders of community foundations that are listening in today all across Minnesota, but across the country as well. I love the idea that social equity should actually be our ambition. And you've set a very good reason and a very good course of action for us to consider how we might get on that. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to invite our president and CEO, Steve Jewell, to come back on screen. He has some closing comments, and thank you again to our panelists.
Yes, round of applause, and unfortunately we can't hear everybody, but wow. We wanted to start off this conference with an engaging conversation that would provide thoughts and discussion going forward into the next few days. And absolutely, all of you accomplished that in sharing your remarks. So many good things were said. And like Sarah, I have many notes. I love the justice is what love looks like in public. And when we think about our work as community foundations, I think that sums it up. So thank you to our speakers, to Liwanag, Tonya, Neel. We really, truly appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us and to share your thoughts and to spark conversation that hopefully will lead to meaningful action and not just words. And the one thing that community foundations have is a very unique position within their communities, working with donors, people who have wealth, have resources, and working with the nonprofits who are on the ground, making a difference. And it's a privileged position, a position that sometimes we don't always fully grasp or understand what we have the power to do. And so truly, I hope we can take your words to heart and really take our work and help turn it into action. So thank you so much to the speakers. We really appreciate you being with us today. Also, I want to once again thank our sponsors, the Koya Go, the Minnesota Initiative Foundations, the Blandin Foundation, Minnesota Council on Foundations and Data Marketing. We greatly appreciate your support in making these conversations and this interaction all possible. This afternoon, we have a number of sessions and breakouts where you can go into other rooms basically and learn more, as well as to carry on the conversation. And so I want to encourage you to take time to do the asset development or community impact or board engagement sessions at 1:15, building relationships, donors in uncertain times, the community impact, an example of building bridges through community policing, a wonderful example taking place here in St. Cloud, and then board engagement, discussing the roles of board leadership. At 2:30, we really don't have any topics, but we just simply have some networking groups set up for you to go in on topical areas and network and meet others and carry this conversation forward. And at 3:15, we have another session on community impact, how to empower and support nonprofits, and a nuts and bolts session on how to fund operations and understanding growth. And finally, at 4:30 is a happy hour, and that our staff has some fun things planned, and we're inviting people to come and share something about your community. If you have something you want to share as far as something that represents your community. But once again, it's all about interacting and conversation. And as we said, hopefully conversation that turns to action. So once again, a huge thank you to our speakers. I also want to thank Terry Barrero as a board member and Sarah for leading the facilitation and Q&A in our most recent session. And thank you all for being here and now engaging in the conversations that we have the opportunity to do. So please join us in the breakout rooms. If you have any questions whatsoever, please email us at admin@communitygiving.org. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the breakout sessions. Have a great day.